Hello, and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. Perhaps you're working on a project and you despair of it ever being a success. Or perhaps you're working on yourself and everything you've ever done seems like a hopeless failure. Well, if you are, just consider the Avro Manchester. The Avro Manchester was the father of the Avro Lancaster, and the Avro Lancaster was one of the most successful heavy bombers of the Second World War. It dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs over enemy territory, was the spearhead of Bomber Command's offensive against Nazi Germany, and flew on the famous Dams raid, led by Wing Commander Guy Gibson, making it an iconic symbol of Britain's resistance and final victory. To highlight this, over 7,000 were built by a network of over 900 companies. The Manchester, however, was none of these things. It dropped only 1,826 tons of incendiaries in 1,250 sorties, and when production ended soon after it had begun, barely 200 had been built. Its operational career lasted about a year, and when it ended, 77 aircraft had been shot down over enemy territory, and 44 had been lost in mundane accidents, many caused by its own engines. But what is worth remembering is that the Lancaster was 70% a Manchester. All of its achievements and later successes were the product of brilliant design by Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, and hard work by Avro's engineers, who built up their skills on this unlamented and unloved aircraft. Its story began 3 years before Britain was even at war. In November 1936, the Air Ministry issued Specification P13-36, calling for a twin-engine medium bomber using Rolls-Royce Type 10 engines, later renamed as the Vulture. The plan was for them to replace the Whitleys, Hampdens, and Wellingtons, which were edging towards obsolescence even before a shot had been fired. The aircraft should have a top speed of 275 miles an hour, with a minimum range of 2,000 miles and a bomb load of 8,000 pounds. To make things more complicated, they would also have to operate as a short-range tactical bomber that was able to dive on its target at an angle of 60 degrees. In fairness to the Air Ministry, who seemed to have wanted an aircraft with the payload of a B-29, the performance of a B-17, and dive capability of a Dauntless, the problem was not so much the specification as the chosen power plant. The Vulture was essentially two 12-cylinder Peregrine engines bolted one on top of the other in an X configuration, driving a single crankshaft, giving it 24 cylinders and around 1,700 horsepower. This was at a time when a first-generation Merlin could deliver only 1,000 horsepower. On paper, this made it a winner. In practice, the engine had a complex lubricating system and even then was prone to severe overheating. Avro had at least been doing development work on a similar design for a bomber, so when the request came in, they were partially prepared. It helped that their chief designer was an understated genius. Roy Chadwick was 10 at the time of the first powered flight. He was so inspired that he had made his first model planes and flown them at night in case he was laughed at. Unsurprisingly, he seemed to have inherited the family gift for engineering, so joined British Westinghouse as a trainee draftsman when he was just 14. He later attended Manchester College of Technology 3 nights a week to improve his skills, and even joined Manchester Aero Club, which led him to visit the Avro company. The tiny company was busily working away in the cramped cellar of Brownsfield Mill, a busy cotton mill in Ancoats, a suburb of Manchester. Avro & Co. bore the name of founder and leading light, Elliot Verdon Rowe, who gave Chadwick a job. Chadwick rewarded him by going on to design a series of aircraft that put Avro, as the company would become, on the map. These included the Avro 504, which helped to popularize flying after the First World War, the record-setting Avro Aviation, used by pioneer pilot Bert Hinkler, and a range of others that suggested the company and Chadwick was steadily getting more ambitious. He even worked on a very early military aircraft called the Avro 528, known as a Manchester, which was also designed to serve as a heavy bomber. Verdon Rose sold his company to Armstrong Siddeley in 1928, and it later became a subsidiary of Hawker Siddeley. Chadwick moved with it on each occasion, and having worked in Southampton for several years, moved with it back to Manchester. All of Avro's designs so far had been like Chadwick's earlier Avro Anson, a mix of wooden and tubular steel construction. But if the new bomber was going to meet the Air Ministry specification, it seemed as though Avro would finally have to get to grips with more modern, stressed skin methods. Chadwick later told a BBC interviewer, in 1926, after studying carefully the various types of construction then in vogue, I decided that the future of constructing airplanes would be the all-metal stressed skin method. I incorporated this type of construction in the Avro Avocet, an experimental type which we built for the ministry, and in a second type in 1927, the Avro Antelope. Unfortunately, I could not persuade anyone that this method of construction was the best, and I had to abandon it for about 10 years, although, as most of you know, this type of construction is now almost universally employed. As you will see, even in such a rapidly advancing Department of Engineering as aviation, one mustn't try to go too far too fast. The new all-metal stressed skin design was known initially as the Avro 679, and was due to compete against a design from Handley Page known as the HP-56. This only exists as a series of plans which suggests it would have been a thick-winged aircraft reminiscent of a twin-engine Halifax. Handley Page withdrew their design from the competition. They perhaps knew that their conservative aircraft was not a potential world beater, but there was also some bickering with the Air Ministry over its defensive armament and bomb load. In any case, the company's focus was the Halifax, and there were already pressing concerns about the reliability of the Vulture. As there were no other designs to consider, just 8 weeks after Avro had submitted Chadwick's proposal, the new aircraft was given the go-ahead in April 1937. Before we continue with the video, I want to thank BetterHelp, the sponsor of today's video. Stress and anxiety are both things you tend to have to deal with when you start doing YouTube full-time. I remember a specific time when I poured a huge amount of effort, time, and research into a video, only for it to perform quite poorly. That really hit me, and I felt pretty down at that point. Keeping up with the upload schedule and hanging on the performance of each video became something that impacted my personal life. Having a professional to talk about the workload and stress management during that time would no doubt have been very helpful. Without the stress during that period, I think it's likely that I could have grown the channel quicker and got a team together to work on videos sooner than I ultimately did. Running a business is incredibly rewarding, but it can also be incredibly stressful, and sometimes we all need a little extra support to handle the stress and anxiety of life. That's where BetterHelp, the sponsor of today's video, comes in. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site, answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like you. You can do it all from your phone or computer, via phone call, video chat, or messaging, however you feel the most comfortable. It's the easiest possible way to start talking to a therapist. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/aviation deep dive or choose Aviation Deep Dive during sign-up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Construction of the prototype did not begin until June 1939, perhaps reflecting the steep learning curve that Avro now found themselves at the bottom of. The Avro 679 was to become the Manchester, after the city where it was being built. Chadwick had suggested a 4-engine variant of the Manchester to the Air Ministry, but was given lukewarm backing from the Ministry and little support from Avro. With a bit more foresight, it is possible that the Avro Lancaster could have arrived a couple of years earlier, but it was not to be. 2 prototypes were ordered in the shape of aircraft numbered L7246 and L7247, but even before either made their first flight, the government ordered 200 aircraft to the rewritten specification 19-37, although more were planned. The performance of the Manchester would soon lead to the production run ending early. and while the specification had been altered to remove requirements, presumably including the idea it should be used as a partial dive bomber, this was little used now that the aircraft was already being built. The prototype, numbered L7246, first flew at Ringway on the 25th of July 1939, piloted by Captain Harry Albert Brown, known as Sam. He had been injured in the first flight of Chadwick's Avro Avocet, but seemed not to hold this against him. The Manchester, however, was going to try and do what the Avocet could not, and kept making repeated attempts to kill its pilot. While directional stability was sorted out after the first few test flights with the addition of a third central rudder, the Vulture was not so easily fixed, and Brown experienced repeated crash landings. One ended in a field, another had to be carried out after one engine tore itself to pieces in mid-air. What was becoming obvious was that whatever the strengths of the airframe, the Vulture was wholly unsuitable for a combat aircraft. They always ran hot, which meant they needed constant attention from a flight crew who should have been more preoccupied with navigation and enemy fighters. Keeping oil circulating around them was often a problem, and meant the bearings often failed. And just as worryingly, the aircraft could not maintain height on one engine. Even so, the testing program continued. An L7247 flew in May 1940, fitted with front, rear, and ventral gun turrets, each with two 303 guns. The Manchester's wingspan also increased by over 3 meters to preserve stability. In time, it was decided that the ventral turret would be replaced by the spring-loaded escape hatch, and the aircraft would have both a dorsal turret and self-sealing fuel tanks as well. But this would only come after the aircraft had entered production. The ventral turret was particularly unpopular and hard to get out of. A task one air gunner said was a task best suited to an undernourished dwarf. Around 45 of the initial order of 200 were to come from the Metropolitan Vickers and would be built at nearby Trafford Park. Deliveries from Avro started in July 1940, but those from Metropolitan Vickers were delayed by 9 months after the factory was bombed in December 1940, destroying an initial batch of 13 aircraft. The first delivery from this factory did not come until March 1941. Extensive trials took place at Boscombe Down and Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. With these complete, 207 Squadron, then based at Waddington, collected their first aircraft, numbered L7279, from 6th Maintenance Unit at Bryce Norton and headed to Boscombe Down for conversion training. But they were to get little flying time. The engines were often unserviceable, and although the aircraft formally entered service with the RAF on November 6, 1940, the Air Ministry had now decided to abandon the design. In their opinion, it could not be redeemed by any further changes. It could be made more survivable in the short term, however. Later production aircraft had a modified tailplane with span increased to 10 meters. The tailplanes themselves were increased in height and made more elliptical, with the central fin removed, and 4 guns were added to the rear turret. Aircraft with these modifications were to be redesignated Manchester Mark 1A, and all Mark 1 aircraft were to be modified. One anonymous Manchester pilot later remembered, "I was one of the 6 original pilots to have flown with the first Manchester Squadron. That was a disaster." The aircraft itself, the airframe, had many shortcomings in equipment in the beginning, but as we found out, Avro were excellent in doing modifications and re-equipping the aeroplane. The engines never were and never did become reliable. They did not give enough power for the airplane, so we ended up with 2 extremely unreliable 1750 horsepower engines having to haul a 50,000-pound aircraft. We should really have had 2,500 horsepower engines. You felt that if you lost one, that was it. You weren't coming home. It didn't matter if you feathered the propeller or not. There was only one way you went, and that was down. I have seen an aircraft doing a run-up on the ground and have 2 pistons come right out through the side of the engine. The original bearings were made without any silver as an economy measure, so they weren't hard enough. The bearings would collapse the connecting rod, and the piston would fling itself out through the side of the engine. Bang! Your aircraft just destroyed itself. It also had no cabin heating. Instead, the crew had electrically heated flight suits which connected to a socket at each crew station. This too often failed to work, which was a problem in the winter at Waddington, and especially difficult when the aircraft got to its cruising altitude of 15,000 feet. On February 11, 1941, 97 Squadron was formed from B Flight of 207 Squadron, and the first offensive sorties were flown on the night of February 24th against the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. The ship was struck in Brest Harbor after a collision there had wrecked its propeller, but the crew need not have worried. Not a single bomb hit it, but repeated attacks did at least cause the ship to be moved to Kiel. While no Manchesters had yet been lost due to enemy action, one crashed on landing back at Waddington due to faulty hydraulics, and when 5 Manchesters went on a bombing sortie 2 nights later, one had to turn back, yet again due to a problem with their leaking hydraulics. The first loss to enemy action came on March 13, 1941, when a Manchester was shot down by a Luftwaffe night fighter just 5 miles from its base. A second was shot down 3 weeks later. 4 aircraft from 97 Squadron flew against naval targets in Kiel on the 8th of April 1941, but all the Manchesters were grounded on April 13th due to persistent faults with engine bearings, and were then grounded again on June 16th for the Vultures to be modified and given an overhaul. And then they were grounded again due to a similar problem that the previous 2 overhauls were supposed to fix. Crews had also realized something else. The Vultures gave off sparks mixed in with its engine exhausts, which meant that the German night fighters didn't need radar. They just needed to look into the night sky to see where the Manchesters were. It also became clear that the feathering controls on the Vulture had a tendency to fail and make it even more difficult to fly the Manchester on one engine. Just how difficult is shown by the story of pilot officer Kipper Herring. He had one engine shot out over Berlin and duly feathered it, flying home at 1,000 feet with the crew throwing out any equipment not needed to keep the aircraft flying. He won a gallantry award. If few were lost, it was because few were able to get into the air, but Bomber Command had no choice but to persist until an alternative was available. Black humor amongst the crews said that the reason why they were based in Lincolnshire was because it was flat, and that gave them plenty of choice for emergency landings. A maintenance officer put in a request for 10 miles of elastic to be used to power the Manchester's propellers instead of its engines. One gunner remembered. Other diverting incidents included the complete shearing off of all port propeller retaining bolts, a takeoff with 2,800 RPM port and 4,000 RPM starboard, and the time a constant speed unit gave up the ghost over Essen. The resulting howl must have terrified the ground defenses. It certainly shook us. Later generations of aircrews never knew how interesting life could be dodging the Happy Valley flak. This was RAF slang for the Ruhr, at 8,000 to 9,000 feet and wondering what was going to fall off next. The amount of Manchesters being put into the air slowly grew. A force of 26 was involved in a raid against the Renault factory in Billancourt to the west of Paris, which was making 20,000 vehicles a year for the Germans, and parts for the aviation industry. The raid halted production for 4 weeks, destroyed over 700 completed vehicles, and damaged or destroyed 40% of the buildings. It was also the first raid completed under the leadership of Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, and pioneered the use of the bomber stream, where aircraft followed a common route to the target, taking off to a strict timetable so that a succession of waves arrived over the target. These tactics would later form a huge part of Bomber Command's strategy. When Bomber Command staged its first 1,000 bomber raid on May 30th, 1942, known as Operation Millennium, it did so with 46 Manchesters, close to a quarter of the total number of aircraft supplied to the RAF. But within this raid were Lancasters, the aircraft that would mean the career of the Manchester was already drawing to a close. And the Manchester was not popular with pilots who had flown both. Pilot Peter Ward Hunt remembered, "I was temporarily in charge of a training flight at Scampton at the time, training crews to transfer from Manchesters to Lancasters. We got the call that a special raid was on, and that all crews were to be involved. Well, I didn't get a Lancaster. I ended up with an old Manchester. The Cologne raid also saw a Manchester pilot win the type's only Victoria Cross. D for Dog, with the serial number L7301, was being flown by Flying Officer Leslie Manser and was seen as a defective aircraft. It was only being used now to try and meet the magic number of 1,000 aircraft. The crew found that with a full bomb load on board, it would not climb any higher than 7,000 feet, but Manser chose to continue the flight. The Manchester was hit by flak over Cologne, and its pilot was only able to regain control at 800 feet. Worse yet, the aircraft's bomb bay doors were missing, and it was now on fire. The aircraft had slowly climbed to 2,000 feet when the port engine exploded and started another fire. Keeping his cool, Manser waited for the flames to burn out and then coolly headed for home. It became clear on the journey back that the aircraft was not going to make it, as its speed started to drop close to stalling point. Manser had the crew bail out, as he kept the aircraft flying and refused to parachute to safety to give them the best chance of survival. He crashed near the Belgian village of Brie and was killed. Of the crew, one was captured. One died after bailing out shortly before the aircraft crashed, but the rest evaded the Germans and made their way back to the UK, where they helped get Manser his Victoria Cross. The citation read, impressing home his attack in the face of strong opposition, in striving against heavy odds to bring back his aircraft and crew, and finally, when in extreme peril, thinking only of the safety of his comrades, Flying Officer Manser displayed determination and valor of the highest order. Other stories of sadness and sacrifice emerged, often many years later. Manchester L7465 was a Mark I which was returning from a mission to Essen when it was caught by a searchlight over Belgium and shot down by a Messerschmitt Me-110 flying out of Venlo in the Netherlands. All 7 of the crew were killed. Over 60 years later, a retired local policeman said that he had learned of a local forester who had removed a ring from one of the crew and kept it. His dying wish was for it to be reunited with the Emmons family. Research suggested it was the property of Sergeant Paul Marquez, and it was duly returned to his family 6 decades later. The 7-man crew are as close to being representative of every crew who flew with Bomber Command as you were likely to find. Some were English, one was from Northern Ireland, another came from Queensland and Australia, and Marquez himself was from Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Manchesters were used again in the largely unsuccessful 1000 bomber raid on Essen on June 1st, and in the third and final 1000 bomber raid against the Focke-Wulf factory in Bremen on June 25th. This was also their final operational sortie. There had been rough plans for a Manchester II, with Bristol Centurus or Napier Sabre engines, but nothing ever materialized, and attention had turned to a Manchester III with 4 Merlin engines. A year or so before the last sortie over Bremen, orders from the Air Ministry to Avro were to complete the order of 200 Manchesters and then to start making the Handley Page Halifax, seen as the best possible 4-engine replacement. For a huge range of reasons, including industrial pride, Avro disliked this idea and suggested an alternative. Their plan was to hasten development on the Manchester III, which would use around 70% of the same components, meaning that they could be rapid conversions of the production line. The Air Ministry gave their proposal cautious permission, which led to one Manchester, serial number BT308, being pulled off the line and converted. It flew in January 1941 from what was now RAF Ringway, and was essentially a Manchester 1A with a slightly increased wingspan, now measuring 32 meters, and 4 Merlins, replacing the hated Vultures. The pilot was Captain Sam Brown, who had flown the first Manchester, and he was clear that the new aircraft was not just an improvement over what had gone before, but was in a class of its own. To draw a line under the Manchester saga, the aircraft was quickly renamed. As the Lancaster, it was in service in time to fly on the first 1000 bomber raid alongside the Manchester it would shortly replace. At the same time, Chadwick was interviewed on the BBC and concluded by saying, I would say to young engineers that aeroplane design and construction is the most fascinating, exciting, and heartbreaking business in the world. The Manchester was indeed a heartbreaking failure, but every failure contains some of the ingredients for future success. And out of the Manchester came one of the greatest aircraft of the war, and endless stories of its crew's bravery, from Kipper Herring to Leslie Manser, or the untold story of L7465. Its crews flew, fought, and died together, and any account of the Manchester needs to remember that while the aircraft was flawed, the men who developed it into a world beater and who flew it while the RAF waited have a richly deserved place in Britain's aviation history. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this episode of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.